Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. People who work the day shift at non-haunted places and don't spend all their time in the woods, what's the creepiest thing that's ever happened while at work? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Not creepy, but definitely frightening. I used to manage a small family-owned retail store. It was the 4th of July, and the owners, of course, took the day off and dropped the responsibility on me. We had two stock boys bringing up some items on the forklift when I heard banshee screaming coming from outside the storefront. One of them comes flying through the front door on one leg, spewing profanity, before collapsing on the ground. I look down and see his actual ankle, like the bone. Blood is going everywhere. Dude was riding tandem on the forklift, a giant safety no-no, when the driver took a hard turn and sent the kid off the side, running over his foot. The driver screeched to a halt, thought he stopped on the kid's foot. He didn't. So he popped the forklift in reverse and ran over the foot again. Anyway, I learned that day that I keep my cool in emergency situations. Grabbed and elevated the kid's foot, instructed someone to call 911. Always tell a specific person to call 911. Never say, someone call 911, and another person to get towels to try and stop the bleeding. I held his foot up until the EMTs came. They managed to save the kid's foot, but he had a battle ahead of him. His foot went necrotic, and he went septic. I think that's the right term at one point, but he survived. I don't work there anymore. There were a lot of unsafe practices going on, and the owners didn't treat their employees very well. I left about 3 years ago, and surprise, surprise, they shut down about a year and a half later. Our old house was on a corner, and in lieu of a backyard had a side yard with a small deck that wrapped around the back. The dining room had patio doors that led out the back, and we would have barbecues and such back there. When I was about 14, we only had one desktop computer and one laptop for the family. My brother and I would fight over the desktop. That's where Diablo 2 was installed, so I would use the laptop to write music. On one particular night, my brother had a friend over, and they were downstairs doing whatever, and I was at the dining room table on the laptop. As I was wrapped up in my writing, I didn't pay much attention to my surroundings. I heard a knock on the patio door, which startled me. I looked up, expecting my brother or his friend. The basement had a door that led to the back deck as well. Standing at the door and waving was a person. Could not tell sex or age, wearing a Halloween pig mask. Thinking it was my brother or his friend, I mouthed, "Good one," and gave the person the finger, and they walked away. As soon as they left, I went downstairs to give them shit, and to my surprise and dismay, they were both sitting on the couch playing PlayStation. They swore up and down that it wasn't either of them, and there was no way one of them could have had the time to get downstairs and unmask before getting on the couch. To this day, I have no idea who it was that knocked and waved. TL, DR, a creepy F in a mask knocked on my patio door and waved. It wasn't anyone I knew. This happened quite a few years ago when I was at university. My friends and I were living on a ground floor flat, and my room was at the front of the building. Outside my window was a front garden. My boyfriend at the time and I had literally just finished having sex, and I put my head on the pillow and glanced to my right, which is where the window was. There was a gap between the curtain and the window, and I was met with a pair of eyes watching me. We both, me and the Peeper, had the instinct to look away and then quickly look back. At this point, I shouted to my ex that there was someone watching us from outside. He jumped, opened the window, and shouted various amusing warnings. He could see that the grass was disturbed, so someone had been there, and by the looks of it, more than once. From further inspection the next morning, we found out that he had jumped the small hedge and exited through my neighbor's garden. I told my friends, and I was pretty freaked out by the whole event. However, my lovely friends decided to walk by my flat late the next night, bang on the window, and make sex noises. Almost shot myself. 18 years old, and first time ever operating a Dozer with an open-air cabin roll cage. I was clearing trees out of a waterway on a farm. All of a sudden, I'm knocked out, come to and blood is running down my face into my lap. Dozer is pushing up against the tree, just spinning tracks. My neck and head hurt. I thought I'd been shot or something. No idea. Nobody is around me. I wasn't told how to shut off the Dozer, as it was an older 6C. You don't just turn the key off. I called my dad and he ran over. Pulled the idle bar all the way down and it shut off. We were both clueless as to what happened. Then, he sees a branch behind my head that I must have driven through and pushed it forward pretty far. And it snapped back into the cab and hit me in the forehead. I never saw it or anything. I work in a supermarket early shift, and part of my job is changing the shelf labels for the price changes each day. Just this past Wednesday, I was putting new labels on a shelf of hand soap when about 2 feet along the shelf from me, a bottle shot off and landed in the middle of the aisle. I looked along the aisle at my colleague, and she just shrugged her shoulders and said, "Happens all the time." I've never directly witnessed anything else, but being one of the first to shop floor each day, I'm now questioning all the items that I see sitting in the aisles first thing, and guessing I can't blame untidy customers for them all. Sure, it could be ghosts, or it could be, maybe coworkers that are a little less motivated on the overnights that just don't want to pick something up. Or, ghosts. Years ago, when I was a senior in high school, I had a day where I wasn't feeling great. So I decided, as I occasionally did, to skip out on my last 2 classes and head home. That meant no school buses, obviously, so I would just walk the 3 miles home. Before the age of computer cell phones, this was a pretty long, boring hike to take, so I decided to take a shortcut through some small wooded trails along the creek. Eventually, I came across a dead cat lying in the middle of a trail. As I walked around it, I noticed another dead cat to my left. I looked to my right, and sure enough, there was another. Creeped out, I looked behind me and noticed 2 more, and yet another 2 in front of me. They were all laid out in a giant circle, with one in the middle. It was almost like a half-assed pentagram. I sped up the pace and got the hell out of there. Never take that trail again. Thinking back, a really weird thing is that there was no visible damage to any of the cats, blood or cuts. The dead. My 3-year-old, who is normally very happy and lucky, was extremely concerned the other day. He kept looking around the room and talking about the Rhino. Who knows what a 3-year-old might translate as a rhino? This went on for about 20 minutes. He was very concerned and looked around the entire time. So we get to a point where he says the rhino's moving. My wife asks me where the rhino is. "He's coming to Daddy." "Yeah, I'm Daddy." And my ass puckered up just a wee bit at that comment. Fast forward about 4 days last night, and he starts talking about the ghost. My daughter asks my son, "Where's the ghost?" And my son says, "He's biting Daddy." What the actual F? At the time, my husband and I were living on another continent from his mother, and he hadn't talked to her in a month. He woke up absolutely panicked in the middle of the night after having a dream about his deceased grandma. He was supposed to help her fight some man and get out of his mom's basement, but the man was too strong, and he couldn't. He called his mom at 3 a.m., and he is not the type of person to call his mom in the middle of the night, to find out that his mom had just finished a seance in her basement because she'd been having trouble with Grandma's spirit. Up until that moment, I did not believe in ghosts. The summer after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. I spent the night at the beach watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, no light pollution, I got to my car and started driving down the highway, M22. After about 10 seconds of being at speed, there was an older Tahoe, late 90s, that started riding my ass and flashing its high beams. So I got up 60 in a 45. They were still on my ass. I pulled off onto the side of the road that my parents' cabin is off of, and they took the same turn. I thought they seemed weird because there's only about 30 to 40 houses on the road. So I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end, but leads to a maintenance area for the golf club nearby. The truck was still following me. At this point I was freaking out because I pulled into the house. They'd know where we lived and they were still following close by. I took a ton of random turns and the truck kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic going through the intersection, which gave me a few seconds of a head start. I pulled down a side street, went up about 100 yards, turned off all my lights, and waited. The truck slowly drove by, and the main road, perpendicular to the street, and kept going. I booked it home, pulled my car around the sideway from the main road, and pulled every curtain. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as hell that night. My sophomore year in college, I ran into this guy who was a year younger than me. Let's call him Mitch. Mitch and I were acquaintances who ran in the same circles. He's a nice guy, smart and quiet. At parties, he would just really cool 3D shapes in the corner instead of interacting. He would always just watch everybody. Anyway, I ran into him at a bus stop and I stopped to say hello. We had an awkward chat about our majors, his physics, mine. And I asked if he had any contact with a mutual friend who went into the army. He said yes, and I said, "Great, could you pass him my number?" He opened his wallet and pulled out a piece of paper. The only thing in there, it had to be my son. It had my name, university address, and phone number. I used to live in a small 2-bedroom apartment by myself. The lounge room was right outside my bedroom. One night, I woke up and could hear something moving out there. I got up to check, and the pedestal from my fan was on and slowly oscillating back then. At the time, I convinced myself it was some sort of electrical fault as it was plugged into a board that turned all of the sockets off when I turned the main switch off, which was the TV. I went back to bed and ended up getting sleep. It was a few days later that I realized that the fan had never been set to oscillate the whole time I owned it. I'm glad I didn't figure that out the same night. I was walking down the street when I saw a rusty old nail in a board. I picked it up and threw it into an empty house's yard. Not helpful, I know. After I threw the nail, a man came out of what I thought was an empty house and shouted at me. I freaked out, thinking it was about the nail, and kept walking toward my house. The guy didn't sound mad, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. He started following me to the street and gesturing me to cover, but my gut told me to keep on walking. I get home and see from my house that the empty house is now surrounded by cops. At this point, I still think it's the nail. After a while, it gets worse, and men in full gear show up. I found out later that the house was indeed empty. The men inside were known criminals, and I very much almost ended up a hostage. I often visit Walmart in the wee hours of the morning. One time I went in at about 2 a.m. and noticed an elderly gentleman asleep on one of the mobility scooters at the entrance. When I left about 20 minutes later, he was still there. I thought it was a little odd that no one from the store had woken him up, but whatever. I found out later, the next day, he had died and spent the better part of a day on display as a corpse at the entrance of Walmart. I work for a company with multiple sites. The couple who owns the business tend to acquire new sites through realty connections to the Catholic Church. We're talking like old church buildings, halls, rectories, really anything they're not using anymore. It wouldn't faze me, but I visit our centers a lot, and I have heard some crazy shit from our workers. One cemetery is in a really old church, where over the years there have been Kings and different restaurants and local ventures. When we acquired it, the building was derelict, and there was a hopeless and homeless man living there. Businesses always fail after a few years, and to tell you the truth, we're not doing so well ourselves. Everything looks like a dark cathedral when you're shutting people down, and every sound you make feels like the worst sound you've ever heard. The worst one is one in an old house we've occupied for years. We're turning the attic into a new room, and 2 of the workers refused to go up there. It turns out they had an experience with a trap door in the middle of the day. One fell flat on her face, covered in cold sweat, after they opened this door, and I wouldn't believe her, but then the other worker was there as a witness. But the best part of the thing was, we get to the centers exorcised on a regular basis by a local priest. I live in this old little house built around 1900, so I assumed I would get haunted. I'm living on my own for the first time, and I'm a pussycat. The first night, it sounded like something was scratching the outside wall. I got so scared that I made my friend stay on the phone with me until I fell asleep. So, for around the next 10-ish months, I heard it many times. But now, it sounded like someone walked in the attic, around the walls, and under the house. I got scared a lot. I almost convinced myself there was a homeless ghost person living under my roof. Sometimes I had a knife in my bed, and so on. A few weeks ago, the house owner came and was like, "We found mouse poop we kill. And if there's at all quiet, and I probably have mouse ghosts in my house."